Matt Kirkner on the Tech Ed podcast, and it is what we are building, the summer of artificial intelligence. It doesn't matter where we go, doesn't matter who we talk to. Everybody wants to talk about AI, whether they understand it or not, whether they realize how it's going to totally transform their lives or not. That is the topic of the day, not just in technical education and education in general, but across the entire economy. As we record this episode, I just returned from the state of North Dakota, where I delivered the keynote address at North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum's annual Summit on Innovative Education. We talked all about artificial intelligence. We talked about various aspects of it, how it's changing the economy, how it's changing education, how it's changing the student experience. One of the things we haven't talked about is what is it going to do to instructional design? We have a lot of teachers at every level, K-12 teachers, community and technical college instructors, college professors, and others in education that are looking to artificial intelligence and particularly generative AI as they think about what it can do for them in terms of preparing lesson plans, in terms of preparing amazing learning opportunities for students. This is a really important topic, and we have a really important guest joining us today to talk about that topic. Our guest on this episode of the Tech Ed podcast is Dr. Dwayne Wood. He is Associate Professor at National University. And Dr. Wood, let's just start out by welcoming you to the Tech Ed podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
No, thank you. Again, if I can have any opportunity to talk these education in general, I enjoy it so much. So thank you.
You and I enjoy it as well. I know our audience is going to enjoy this discussion. I know, first of all, they're going to enjoy hearing and learning a little bit about your background, which I think in some ways is unique to the world of education or in the world of education. You started your career in the U.S. military. And I would love for you to, first of all, thank you for your service. Never want to look at an individual who served our country in that fashion and not thank them, not just for their service, but for our freedom. And I mean that quite sincerely. So thank you for that. But tell us about this experience in the U.S. Army. And we always love fascinating war stories, war in a quote of quotes, of course, perhaps. But tell us a little bit about that experience, Dr. Wood.
You know, it's always dangerous to ask an old soldier, talk about your, some great experiences or war stories, because we could go on forever. But, for me, in coming to this career field in education, is I was a non-commissioned officer in the Army. So if anybody doesn't know, that's the enlisted side, and not a commissioned officer, which you think of as generals and colonels and stuff. I was a sergeant, right? And I don't care across any of the services. When you're a sergeant, you're a teacher. It's inherent to the job. And as I progressed in my military career, 15, 18 years in, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. I found that I was pretty good in the military service and I enjoyed it. But at some point, I had to move on. And I finally came to the realization that, I'm already educating. I'm already doing that. I enjoy that. I'm going to pursue that after. And I was pretty fortunate in, my last job in the Army. I actually was able to teach military science, military history at the university level for the Army, for the ROTC program. And that just, coupled with my education and my experience going towards in education and teaching and instructional design, and being able to apply that directly in and out of uniform. I continued after retiring from the service, continued to do that for the Army as a contractor. So it was very fortunate for me that path kind of lined up for me, when I retired.
Well, I love that line about being a sergeant in the military, being a sergeant in the Army. You're really a teacher. I could actually totally see that. I also love the conversation about the teaching experience that you had while you were enlisted, and then you transition into this world of teaching. So I'd like to just hear a little bit more, Dwayne, about that transition, talking about going from military to the world of teaching, and you've worked with veterans as well. So help us understand the transition from one to the next.
It's a fantastic, thought, because I've had to reflect on that quite a bit, because going from a military educational context to a civilian and higher education specifically, there's a difference in goal. And what I mean by that is, in military education, even when I was teaching at the university, but the ROTC program, the goal is always, how am I going to apply whatever you're teaching me directly into the role that I'm training for. And there's this direct application. But when you get into higher education, a lot of times it feels like it's knowledge for knowledge sakes, or it's an academic exercise. And so to me, that was a hard transition when I talk about the context of education, was because I came to this higher education with this belief that if I'm not teaching you something and you can't make the connections to your real world life application, I'm wasting your time. So to me, that was part of a bedrock of my teaching instructional philosophy when I made this transition, that sometimes didn't go over well in the other contexts that I was working, higher education context. And there's two areas that it took a little bit for me to understand. And because in the service, we're very mission focused, and selfless service are two like bedrock values across the services. And you find yourself now in maybe a civilian organization, and nobody else has that same mission focus or that sense of urgency or sense of purpose, and that can be frustrating in that you're operating at a different speed than everybody else, and you're giving up and sacrificing things to achieve the mission that others are not. And for me, even when I was in uniform, I did not do the work life balance very well at all, because I was totally dedicated to the service. I joined when I was 17, so that's all I knew. So I was very much mission focused on everything and didn't get that balance. I didn't really learn that balance until after I retired. Honestly, that's something I had to learn at 40 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
so
Absolutely. Yeah, for me, it's always work-life integration. So I could never do work-life balance all that well. For me, it's always been work-life integration. How do I make it all work together in a fashion that I'm being fair to my family, that I'm being fair to my endeavors outside of work, but also fair to my endeavors at work. Here at the Tech Ed Podcast, we say we're securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. That's our mission here. That's our mission in several of our ed tech companies. I think there's an embedded message in what you just said to any private employer. Or any employer outside of the military, that importance of mission, that importance of shared purpose and shared sacrifice is really important. And I think especially as you look at millennials and Gen Z, these are folks that are looking at wanting to have a purpose in the work that they do. And certainly you and I would agree that is really, really important. Kind of staying on this topic about your military experience, but also how it led to the way that you do your work in the field of education. Are there things that you brought over from the military in terms of your role as a professor, and particularly in terms of instructional design, that you learned or experienced in the military that you brought to the role that you have now?
in the military, we're steeped in leadership. At all levels, tactical, operational, strategic, right? There's all these, and you just grow up in this context of leadership. And what I learned real fast is that leadership and teaching are the exact same thing. We just call them different. We apply and we call the techniques differently, but they're the exact same thing. So I was able to make that transition of this deep training and education experience in leadership and apply that directly to teaching. So for me, again, I think I used an analogy one time. I had my leadership philosophy, because that's one of the things we had to do and had to be posted on the wall and all that good stuff, right? When I was going through my training to be a teacher and instructional designer, I had to have an instructional design or instructor philosophy. And I took my leadership philosophy and I changed like 5 words. Right. It goes from, it was military, so soldier centered, right? And I explained what that meant. Well, I just changed that to student and changed a couple words, right? So to me, it was the exact same. So I was able to apply a lot of that stuff. And then again, I kept to my philosophy, that was steeped in the military, and that, we train as we fight. So I need to produce training and education in authentic contexts and recognize the reality of what's happening versus the ideal academic aspects. I like to tell my students, yeah, we got all these great theories and models, but they're all wrong. You're never going to have that ideal context. You're never going to have that exact same environmental context to apply that theory into. So you have to have a deep enough understanding to make the changes that'll meet the context and still achieve the goal you're trying to achieve. Especially what the service taught me was resource constraints. You do the best you can do with what you have, right? And you can still achieve great learning outcomes with nothing. Some of the best classes I ever taught was outside scratching in the dirt. That's just kind of my philosophy. What I think what the service taught me as a teacher and leader that I carried over into higher education.
Absolutely. I mean, that there's a couple things in that answer that fascinate me. The first one is this whole idea of obviously education being student-centric, and certainly regardless of the level of education, making sure that the learning and that teaching and that education is student-centric. This whole idea of understanding that we need authentic experiences in education, and I'm a huge believer in that as well. I spent my career as our audience knows, in manufacturing, and when I would start going into some of our K-12 tech ed programs and wouldn't see any authentic manufacturing technology, and then we would wonder why we weren't attracting young people to careers in
Hmm.
manufacturing. Well, they didn't have any experience, and just telling them about it isn't going to do it. They have to experience it. They have to do it. So this whole idea of authentic learning and recognizing that the learning should be about training us to fight, not training us for, just some esoteric endeavor that we may face at some point in the future. I love the specificity of that. The other conversation, I was just having a conversation with an education leader in a Midwestern state here within the last couple of days, and we're reflecting on the whole idea is that in a lot of cases, there's very little correlation between the money we're spending per student in K-12, for example, and the learning outcomes in the quality of student, or probably better put, how well we're equipping those students for whatever comes after K-12. Not a lot of correlation necessarily between the money we spend and the outcomes that we're accomplishing. And so your whole idea of being able to sit down and draw in the dirt and teach somebody, it really is about the student. It's about the teacher, whoever's delivering the learning. It's about making that learning real, in some cases, regardless of the budget, and in some cases, regardless of the tools that we're making available to the teacher. So I love that whole idea and the way that informs then how we create those incredible learning experiences for students. And we do that. The technical name for that is instructional design, of course. And for our audience members that may not be completely familiar with what those terms or what those words mean, what do they mean to you, Dwayne, instructional design?
So I like to think of it as the instructional design methods, models, whatever, all the stuff is out there because there's a lot out there. They're just the practical way to apply educational theory within a specific context. I'm not a huge fan that, if I go and work someplace and they say, well, we use the Addy model. Well, Addy is a model. It's not the model, right? And so I'm a fan of I choose the best model that works for the context I'm in. Again, I take this from again, my military service transfer here is that we have this idea of mission command. The lowest level leader makes the decisions because they have the best knowledge of the context that's happening in. And the same way to me. I want my subject matter expert, my instructional designer, working together in developing it in a way that will meet the end state, the goal that we're trying to achieve. Again, they're going to adapt those processes to meet that. But again, we think of that as it's just a systematic way to think through that to produce a learning experience that's going to achieve the outcome that you've desired. Now, I would argue that a lot of times what gets skipped is the analysis behind why we're achieving that objective. And to me, that's important. Is it aligned with much higher strategic goals, much learning things, or is it aligned with what we talk, an authentic application of that knowledge or that skill in the workforce or as a citizen?
So make that real for us. When you say, is it aligned to the outcomes? Give me an example of the types of outcomes you might try to align your instructional design toward.
So I look at two kind of like I call them families. I have one. I have like I call it they're concrete, right? A student will be able to do this, right? Whatever that is. But I also believe that we have to focus on some of the intangible aspects of thinking. So our creative thinking skills, problem solving, right? To me, those are even more important because if I can develop those skills, knowledge transmission becomes easy, right? Because I've developed those. Right now, information literacy skills, being able to evaluate information. I don't know how we get by without having those skills, right? In this day and age. So those are some things that when I think of an objective, yes, I'm going to have that very concrete, but I'm also going to be thinking along the line is, am I helping build problem solving and critical thinking, creative thinking skills along with this same task? Yeah, I'm going to give you a problem. It's going to be pretty difficult to solve because you're going to have to put the cognitive effort into it. But I've also scaffold it so it's well with it's maybe just a little beyond your reach, but I'm going to help you get there. And that's how we can actually achieve that gain in learning instead of just a status quo.
Well, it's interesting that you put it that way, and we talk about things like critical thinking and problem solving and applied learning and troubleshooting is kind of the way we look at a lot of the skills that we try to teach on the technical side. And as we talk to employers, and this is the interesting thing, what we're hearing from them. In fact, I have a meeting later today with a major university on this exact topic when it comes to engineering, and it's like it's yes, we want to make sure that we have students that are technically sound, right? So whatever that, it's electrical engineering, it's mechanical engineering, it's an electromechanical technician, it's an automation technician, whatever role we're putting those individuals in, we want to make sure certainly that they have the technical understanding. But then so many of these other aspects of critical thinking and problem solving and things like project management and being able to work as part of a team and being able to communicate effectively, to be able to sell ideas in the workplace. These are all really, really important skills and competencies that we look for in our technical talent. And so I think it's interesting that, when you think about instructional design and creating these opportunities for students and these outcomes for students, we have to keep so many of those things in mind as we're doing it, as education continues to evolve, although perhaps not as fast as we need it to. You talk about this whole idea of information literacy, and couldn't agree with you more. And one of the things that scares me most, and we're going to get into artificial intelligence and machine learning and so on, and I've got so many news sources that I've relied on over the years, and now you can absolutely tell that they're using a generative AI model to produce the content. And it's like, all right, if I'm just sending a pre-trained transformer out into the world of data and out onto the internet to gather information and predict whatever word makes the most sense to include next in the feedback that it's giving me, how do I know and how do I create individuals that are able to consume that information and really recognize when something is factual and when something might not be, and be able to discern between the two? That's going to be a really important skill as well. So education has to evolve, and one of the things that we worry about here on the Tech Ed podcast is, are we evolving fast enough? I had the opportunity a couple of years ago, Dwayne, to go through my childhood grade school. So it was a McKinley Elementary School in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, and they did an open house for all the students that had ever been there. And I went. Of course, this was now some 40 years later, after I had gone through that school as a student. The thing that was it was really nostalgic and cool and scary all at the same time is it looked exactly the same. I mean, like the bubblers were the same, the desks were the same. They have whiteboards now, and maybe even some cases smart whiteboards, but it was like identical. It's like, oh my goodness. And we had Dr. Joe Gothard, who's now the superintendent of the Madison Public Schools. He used in Wisconsin. He used to be the superintendent of St. Paul Public School District in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And he was on a few years ago, and he said, look, the average American classroom hasn't hardly changed in 50 years. And so, in your view, what do we need to get better? What do you think those shortcomings are in the traditional education model, particularly K-12, and then what do we need to do to update that and freshen it up?
No, I agree with you. And, having kids, who've gone to their schools, I had the same exact reflection. Like, this hasn't changed. It's the same. I think it's this idea of the industrial model. When we do that, we make an assumption. And I think this assumption is not correct. And the assumption is that all our inputs are the same. We're going to put all the inputs in the same. We're going to put it into this thing that we've validated is the process, and it's going to produce this standardized output. And that's not the case. We're talking about human behavior here. I like to say, human behavior, it's like a math equation. When you put infinity into it, anything is possible. Right. So we have to get to the point of where we can get to individualization. That's where technology can be leveraged to achieve that. There's a lot of pitfalls, though, and there's a lot of resource management and considerations that got to be in place. One thing I see all the time, too, when we talk about technology integration, is that there's no true integration into the curriculum. It's kind of like an add-on. And when you do that, you'll never get the benefit from that technology. It has to be fully integrated at the instructional design phase, starting with the analysis. A good instructional designer, a master instructional designer, will explain every single choice they've made and how that influences student learning. Where a novice will just follow a process.
And especially in this day and age when we've got students where, to your point, every single student is different. And so we can't just expect to be able to put your words are perfect, the same input into a student and expect exactly the same output on the other end, because every single student is different. I was certainly a non-traditional learner when I was going through my educational pathway, and I think that's one of the absolute most exciting things about the way that we're bringing technology to bear in education. When we talk to educators, we start out with this idea that you have no idea as an educator relative to other market spaces how much data you have available to you. You have all this data about your students' backgrounds, and you have information about some of their personal problems, and you've got information about their grades and where they came from and what their educational pathway is. And you've got just tons and tons and tons and tons of data, health data as well, in some cases, if we can use it in certain ways. And we can use all that data to predict all kinds of things. So we can predict what student might be at risk of not passing a class, or might be at risk of being on the wrong career pathway, or a career pathway that isn't right for them is probably a better way of putting it, or what student might be at risk of dropping out of school. We can predict those things, and then we can use those predictions to intervene in a way that prevents us from having an undesirable outcome and points us toward an outcome that's more desirable. That's the future of education, personalized education, lesson plans for every student, individual to them. They learn at their own pace. The high flyers can go faster. The ones that need a little extra time can take their extra time. I just think that this is one of the most exciting times, not just in the history of the world, but certainly in the history of education. We're really, really excited about where this is going. Generative AI is a huge part of that. I know you're fascinated by generative AI, and one of the things that we're studying now, and I know you are as well, is the applications of generative artificial intelligence in instructional design. It's funny because I speak on artificial intelligence every week, and this technology is changing so fast that the days of being able to do the same speech 3 years in a row are over. And I think last October, I did a speech to a statewide technical college organization, and I talked about how I just said, write me a syllabus and a lesson plan for a pneumatics program in electromechanical technology, and ChatGPT, as we all know, spit that out in a matter of about 40 seconds. And, it was like 80% perfect, and I had to augment it a little bit to make it my version. And if I got up in front of a group of educators and used that example today, they'd laugh at me, right? Because everybody knows that you can use ChatGPT for that. It's amazing how quickly this technology is moving. I know you're right in the middle of that transformation. So let's talk a little bit about the use of, whether it's ChatGPT or another generative pre-trained transformer, and how we can use that technology in terms of designing lesson plans and use that as opportunities to deliver learning to our students.
I have a paper that's being published soon where I actually looked at trying to understand the student experience in using a Gen AI within an educational context. When I sat down, we were trying to figure out what we were going to do for future courses in instructional design. Again, with this idea that what we're doing in this course needs to be directly applicable to when they go get a job as an instructional designer, right? Have that application. And one of the things we came up with is everybody on the outside, and we talk about in the learning and development industry, AI is becoming normalized within that industry. So if I'm not including AI use within the coursework itself, and not just as a project and how you would use AI with it, but actual use of it in the accomplishment of the learning objectives, I'm doing a disservice to the student, because they're going to go out and have a job interview. And one of the questions they're going to be asked is, tell us your experience with generative AI. And they're not going to have it. So we actually fully integrated it in both ways. One, we allow them to use it. One of the things I came into this study is you have to be transparent. You can't have these closet users of Gen AI, because then you're just asking for ethical issues, and responsible use issues. It's got to be completely transparent. So we made it completely transparent. And then we gave them the opportunity to kind of use it and then reflect. So we built a process in, right? Have the system produce something, rework it, and then reflect on it, because then we're going to produce some higher order thinking not on top of just the system producing something. And really what students come to realize is they start to find the boundaries and the limits of the technology. Now they have a much better understanding of how they would apply it in the actual practice, which we try to simulate in this course, because I don't act as their instructor or facilitator. I act as their peer mentor. And you're going to use an authentic task from your context for the project, or that they're working through. So we try to make it, again, as authentic as we can make it, and a true application where if I get asked that question in an interview, I have an answer.
One of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about on the whole AI front is exactly what you talked about, is how do we design student experiences in the age of artificial intelligence. I'm a graduate of Marquette University here in Wisconsin. There's a professor there, I just read an article about him a couple months ago, who has prohibited the use of generative AI in the coursework. He puts it right in the syllabus that you are prohibited from using generative AI for anything in this course. He makes the student sign a contract that says we will not use generative AI in any of our coursework, and they recognize on the front end that if they're caught doing that, they're at risk of being thrown out of the class and possibly being expelled from the university. 78 miles to the west, University of Wisconsin-Madison, there's another teacher quoted in that same article that said, look, this is the world we are living in. We're doing a disservice to our students if we're not enabling them to utilize artificial intelligence in the work that they're doing. I'm integrating into my class. And I'm usually not this direct, but I would say I 100% agree with the guy from the University of Wisconsin. I 100% disagree with the guy from Marquette University.
Yep.
This is the reality that we're living in, and we absolutely have to use this technology. But now it becomes a question of how. And I think you point to, Dwayne, a couple really, really great examples of, okay, let's prompt generative AI with a question, and then let's let it answer our question, and let's critique the answer. Let's find errors in the answer. Let's talk about what the meaning of what we're learning is, whether it's from that answer or other coursework. I think that, this whole age of how we assess intelligence, how we define intelligence, and how we model the entire education world around that is a really, really exciting time, and certainly an exciting time for the work that you're doing and training the next generation of instructional designers and so on. Let's move from those individuals to the students themselves. How do you see AI affecting the experience of a student as we roll forward?
So, if I was a student going forth, and this technology is only going to get better, right? The CEO from Khan Academy, in his book, he has a chapter that says the genie's out of the bottle and we threw away the bottle, right? To me, that's a perfect analogy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if we had the bottle, you're not going to be able to, you can't put the genie back in. But this technology is going to get more and more robust and much more capable as we go forward. So from a student standpoint, I think sometimes there's this perception, I know there is from my students, there's a hesitation to use it because there's not clear guidelines and clear social acceptance. I think just like you had talked about, they're completely different, polar opposites, right? It comes down to the how, and I'm a fan of this concept of understanding equals motivation, and it's reciprocal. Motivation equals understanding. And that's what we need to produce about this technology. And that doesn't mean that we're all, unicorns and rainbows. It's understanding the true limitations and boundaries of this technology so that we can truly apply it in a way. And that requires critical thinking. And I like to tell my students when they're interacting with this technology in I call it their work, but in this academic aspect of it, think about, why do we form teams? Well, we form teams because we want to leverage their strengths and offset their weaknesses, right? We do that why we form teams. Think of it as you're forming a team with this AI. You are offsetting some of your weaknesses with some of its strengths, but it also has weaknesses that you offset as the human in the loop, right? You understand the environmental context, the emotional aspects, the social norms, all these other things that system is not gonna be able to take into account. And then, and just real quick to add, one of the things that I really like about how this system interfaces, at least right now, is it forces a student to ask a question. And the reason I like that is because, when we grew up in education, right, we got really good at answering questions. We didn't get good at forming questions. So actually, just in the process of forming the question for the system to answer, I've achieved critical thinking, especially if I can get them to iterate off that question to get a different response. They start to understand deeper about how the question is formed and what kind of answer you're going to get.
This whole idea of prompt engineering and making sure that we're coming up with creative ways and effective ways of asking our questions of generative AI. And I think, people don't recognize, if you're just getting started and you're asking a question and you're accepting the answer, and that's fine. But the more specific you can be with that question, the more specific that answer is going to be. The more specific you can be in terms of asking follow-up questions, the more specific that answer is going to be. We are just at the dawn of all this. I love the analogy of the genie's out of the bottle and we threw away the bottle. The other one that kind of plays along with with your last point, and this isn't original. I think I'm stealing it from Ethan Malik, although if it's somebody else, then apologies to whoever that is. This is the worst AI you're ever going to use. So whatever AI you're using today is the worst one we will ever use. It's going to be that much better tomorrow. I was with somebody 2 days ago that had just received a demonstration of ChatGPT 5, and they said that the responses that they were getting and the things that ChatGPT 5 was able to do were just mind-boggling, and we think 4 is amazing, and we think 3 is amazing, or 3.5 is amazing. He said, wait till you see what's coming from GPT 5. So it's the worst you're ever going to see. Is what we're using today. It gets better from here, as amazing as it is. And I know I'm quoting Malik when I say invite AI to the table, that as we're doing, whether it's the student experience, whether it's instructional design, whether it's, hosting a podcast, we have to have AI at the table. We have to think of it as a friend and a coworker, because those of us who do are going to end up leapfrogging everybody that doesn't. I would like to talk about, as we think about integrating AI into everything we do, as you're training the next generation of instructional designers, how are you informing them, Dwayne, about how they are going to be interacting with AI in terms of generating content and in terms of the work that they do?
I like to approach this with my students in an experiential way. So I've given them the context of a work environment that they'll have to
Hmm.
use this to develop a product or a solution. And the course that we did this in, we're really having them produce solutions, not necessarily a product. Like we have them, do an analysis of a performance gap and
Hmm.
then figure out how they're going to close that gap. So as they go through that, they're using this AI technology to help them and assist them along the way. But we've built it in an experiential way so that each student has a little bit different experience in this course and how they apply it and use it. And we force them to reflect on that. And then I act as to bounce ideas off against and to talk about again. I like to think of myself as the peer mentor in this process. I've had students come up with some fantastic ideas of something like, "Oh, that's really great," and how you're applying it. So when I approached the design, this is getting back to design. When I approached the design of this course for instructional design, I was like, I don't want to constrain my students. This is at the master's level too, right? So we can do this a little bit more. I don't want to constrain them. I don't want to give them constraints on its use. I want them to experiment. I want them to figure out the boundaries and limits. I want them to develop their own type of process as they use this and how they would integrate it into their own personal processes. I think it's been pretty successful. That takes a little bit more of my time and effort with them to work them with because I'm truly acting as a mentor, not an instructor when we go through this process. So I think that's important, and it's the same idea I have that when we invite AI to the table, our role changes. So we can't take that traditional role anymore. We have to adapt that role to this new context.
Over the course of the last, several months, as you've been integrating AI into some of the work that you're doing with your students, have you had any feedback from students where they've come back and maybe a specific example for us of, wow, this is really game changing for me?
Yeah, I had a few this last time I did this course, and during the course. Usually that doesn't happen, right? Usually it's afterwards, right? They figure out, oh, I was able to apply that in my real world. This was during the course because I asked the students to try to use their real world context. What's a real problem you have in your because at this course they're all educators, right? So
Hmm.
what's a real education problem you have in your district, your school, your organization, and let me help you analyze it and develop solutions. And one of them was really unique. The student was a third grade visual arts instructor with a high population of non-English speakers. And that was the gap he identified. He identified that I'm having trouble at connecting with my non-English speakers. Here's some things that I've been doing. They're working okay, but it's just not effective. I was like, well, how do you think we would use this type of technology to maybe bridge that gap? He starts thinking about it and he's like, I wonder if it does translation. You know what? It does translation, right? But you probably want to have somebody that is native a speaker so they can see if that it's doing an okay job, right? Just to validate it, right? That it's doing okay. He thought about that and he's like, well, what if I could focus just on the visual aspects of it? I said, you know what? That's a fantastic idea. Let's think about something an exercise maybe, just to give us a context of how we'd use this. What if we took like a Mad Libs context and you have blanks and you have students fill in words and then you use that in a system like Stable Diffusion to produce an image. Then ask them, well, you know what would that look like in cubism? Ask the system, right? And then they can start to get a visual aspect of these differences in visual arts, and you're using this technology to give them a better understanding of what you're trying to achieve. And then you can say, by the way, I want you to develop a picture of your family using the cubism style. Now they have a better understanding. So now you've gone from, not necessarily knowledge transmission, but you're constructing knowledge during the process of that. You could call it instruction, right? That process. And then you get right to creation. So it allows us to leverage technology to get beyond the lower Bloom's level, if we want to call it Bloom's level, to get to higher order thinking skills faster.
So, as we're doing that in education, and as educators of all kinds, because we've got plenty of them that listen to the podcast every week, are thinking through that, give me like the top two or three skills that you think they need to develop in order to do this well as they're interacting with generative AI and bringing the learning to their students in a new way. Give us some specific skills you think they need to have.
One is you got to get good at asking questions. I've seen articles all over the place, right? They talk about, prompt engineering, right? That being like a whole career field now as we go forward. I would say look at some of that stuff, understand how that system interprets what you ask it and what it produces, right? That's a skill there in order to produce it. Understand the different ways to interact with that system. You know, I'm probably not going to get what I want if I ask just a single prompt. I may have to do an idea of chain prompting, right? How to, get it developed on it. The more advanced features of these things, go in and tell the system in its settings the context, right? So that it provides a much more contextual response. Again, you're not probably going to get the 100%. And I think that's some kind of my students sometimes see that too. Like they come into this with, I'm just going to put in a single prompt, it's going to give me a 100% solution. It's not going to do that. The last one is that kind of intangible skill that to me is being able to apply the common sense critical thinking to whatever it responds to. That's a skill that's right. It's intangible and it takes a long time to develop. And in my mind, I can't really teach that to you. I can set up the context for you to learn that, but it comes down to you and understanding how to reflect. To me, that's a whole skill that we don't teach very often. Being able to do a dedicated reflection. I'm stealing a quote from I think Edmund Burke is the one that said it, but he says reading without reflection is like eating without digestion. I would say swap out reading with experience, and that's a critical skill with anything. But I think it's also important with this, being able to look at what it produces, do that evaluation and reflection aspect of it before you even start editing it or using any parts of it. So that to me, that's a really important skill. And I know these sound like some, besides the first one, these are kind of very intangible skills, but that I think that's important in using this technology.
In as much as they're intangible, not actually all that hard to wrap our brains around. So, I think about, a technical education teacher that says, well, give me an example of automation in manufacturing. That could be a prompt. You could ask ChatGPT, or I'm a big fan of Perplexity and others, and it would give you an answer. Or we could ask a question like, I'm running a machining company, and that machining company is located in the upper Midwest, and that machining company is doing work for companies like Harley Davidson and John Deere and Ford. And I'm trying to understand how I can integrate automation into my manufacturing environment. Give me 5 examples of how automation manifests itself in a manufacturing facility like mine. So the first question is, tell me about automation in manufacturing. The second one is, a prompt that's engineered to get a specific result, maybe even give it the name of the machining company. And it is unbelievable how much better of an answer you'll get from generative AI if you ask the right question and ask it in the right way. And so you're saying exactly the same thing. Well, now that teacher has to take the time to reflect on what that answer is. I'm a strong non-believer in coincidence. I think things happen for a reason. I've had 3 people in the last 2 weeks tell me in different ways about the importance of taking the first 30 minutes of the day and not touching your device and just reflecting on life. I'm failing miserably at that. I've tried it a couple times, but especially in this age of technology, it's so easy to go from question to answer, technology to technology, and not take the time to really think about what that means for us. And I think your message there, Dwayne, in terms of taking that time to reflect on the answer we're getting from generative AI, figuring out what that means. If we don't like the answer, we don't quite understand it, ask it another question. It's free. It'll be there. It's not going to be offended. And so really, really good advice for our educators. As we think about some of these things, and we also think about the ethical implications of it. I gave a speech a couple days ago where we talk about the wrong questions in AI in education. The wrong types of questions are questions like, will I lose my job to AI? Or will I need a school in the future of AI? Or my student's going to cheat using AI? You can waste your time if you want on those types of questions. I'm way more fascinated by questions like, what is the meaning of intelligence in the age of artificial intelligence? How is it going to transform education? When we can find an answer to any question at our fingertips, what is education's role now in creating the next generation of individuals and human talent? And one of the things I think we really need to spend time on is, what are those ethical implications of artificial intelligence? What does it mean for our students, and how do we train them on ethical and unethical uses for AI? And how do we prepare our educators for those kind of questions? So on this topic of reflecting, as you reflect on that question, what ethical implications do we have, Dwayne, for the use of artificial intelligence, especially as it relates to designing instructional platforms and so on?
Number one for me, and it's probably applicable outside of it, but I really think about this within the instructional design space, and that's accountability. And what I mean by that is, if I can have ChatGPT run me lessons plans for anything, pretty much, right? And it'll be decent, right? It's not going to be great, um, but if I take that and say that that's what we're going to use, me as the instructional designer has no accountability of the outcomes. Right. So there has to be human in the loops, got to be in there as they go through the process. And you have, as the instructor, I have to take complete accountability of whatever that system produces. It's just like if I use a calculator, I have to take accountability of that answer. Did I plug it in? Did I plug the order of operations in correctly? Right. It's the same kind of way. There has to be accountability at the author or instructional designer level if they're going to use this as a process. And again, it can be very, very helpful. It can speed up processes, but there has to be that level of accountability built into the process. And I think that's directly aligned with the organizational's guidance on AI usage. Especially when it varies so much across the industry. What does that mean? And if there is no guidance, to me, that's even worse. That's worse than not use it at all, in my mind, if there's none. The other one I think is really big, and it's related to accountability. It's transparency. If we're going to use this in our process, we need to be completely transparent that we're using it in our process and be able to articulate how we're using it. On top of that, why? Why did I believe that the use of AI for this specific application it was the best way to go? If I can't answer that question, I shouldn't be using it. At least in my mind. We have to be able to answer why I'm using that tool for that job. And if you think about, especially probably in your tech education and in industry, right? They can answer that question. We're using this technology because of this reason, and it's going to have an impact on our ROI. And we need to be able to do the same thing in instructional design and using any type of technology.
One of the things that drives me crazy, it doesn't happen often, but every once in a while you'll get somebody that blames Microsoft Excel for a mistake in a report. And it's just like, sorry, that's your tool, you're using it, you're responsible and accountable for the outcome on a much more complex level when we start thinking about large language models and training AI on huge amounts of data. And then just trusting it to give us the right answer. Your use of the term human in the loop, and I'll dive into that in a second, is exactly right. You're still accountable. You're still responsible for what that result is. And so we get into this concept of human in the loop. And for our engineers and our technical people in the audience, when we're talking about software in the loop or we're talking about hardware in the loop, and in our engineering programs, we might take a software to simulate a process, but then we take a specific unit of hardware, plug it into that software, and then utilize that to basically model out what might happen in a manufacturing or a technical process. The idea of the human in the loop is we're not only introducing, for instance, a programmable logic controller or perhaps a conveyor or an electric motor to test that in the loop. We are a part of that loop of data. And so the human influence and the human aspect of this and interacting with the AI in a way that makes us part of that process, that invites it to the table, I think that's exactly what you're talking about. So I love the use of the term human in the loop. That won't be the last time our audience hears that. And then this whole idea of transparency. And we talk about what we call the black box in artificial intelligence, and just giving up all this data to some algorithm, some mathematical process or model that we'll never understand. We're not meant to understand, and we'll drive ourselves crazy trying to understand, and we shouldn't try to understand it because we'll blow our brains apart. But also recognizing that the fact that we're using it, the fact that we're throwing the information over the wall of the black box and then taking the information back and maybe using that as part of our work product, it's okay to do that, but also to be transparent in the way that work product has been influenced by artificial intelligence. Really important. So that's terrific advice, I think, for individuals engaging in instructional design. When we think about the rest of the education community, I think that advice also applies, but specific to educators in general, what advice would you give to them and also to instructional designers who are hesitant about incorporating artificial intelligence into the work that they're doing?
To steal Nike's slogan, just do it. Go in and experiment with the system, see what it produces. You're going to find all kinds of information. Do an internet search on how to do AI prompts, right? There's free courses out there, right, that you can take and do it. But experiment and see what it does for you. And I would say, you mentioned there's other things other besides ChatGPT. Try multiple models. I like to have my students try multiple models, plus change some of the word language, like the tone of your questioning or your prompt, and see what different responses you get. I like when I can make the system contradict itself. To me, that's kind of fun, right? So just get in and try it, because You're going to hear all kinds of stuff all over the place, right? I can find articles that say, this AI technology is going to be the death of human civilization, right? But then I can find the exact opposite on the spectrum. How it's going to, how it's going to improve. I would say be skeptical, right? That's an essence of being a critical thinker. But you have to try it. If I get to make any advice, just get in there and try it. It's free.
I asked a similar question to Todd Wanek, who's a good friend and the chief executive officer of Ashley Furniture Industries, and his answer was just start. Kind of like you said, just do it. It's like we just, you're never going to find the perfect time, and it's not hard. I mean, literally, if somebody started now, 90 seconds from now, they could be, they could have ChatGPT downloaded onto their smartphone, and they could be asking a question of it. And you're right. I mean, we always default to ChatGPT, but I'm a big fan of Perplexity. I love creating images using Midjourney. All of these different platforms that are all leveraging artificial intelligence. Copilot. I mean, you can get started on Copilot for hardly any money, if any, if you're using a Microsoft platform. So there's all of these different opportunities to engage with generative AI. If you're not doing it already, you are way behind the curve. But there's still time to catch up. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal that just fascinated me. 20% of us, as of February of this year, were using a generative AI at work. And that was up from 8% last year. And I was like, the most shocking thing about that isn't that it increased by over 100% in terms of the number of people that were using it. It's that it's still only 1 in 5 people were using it at work. It's like, oh my goodness, I'm using this stuff all the time. How can you not be using it yourself? So absolutely, really, really solid advice. Just dive in, just get started. On the topic of advice, and as we're nearing the end of our time here together with Dr. Dwayne Wood of National University, we're going to ask him one last question. It's a question that is certainly familiar to our audience because we pose it to all of our guests here on the podcast as their closing question, and that is if you could go back in time to that 15-year-old Dwayne Wood, that sophomore in high school, and give that individual one piece of advice, Dr. Wood, what would that be?
I definitely could give him, all kinds of, don't do this type of thing. However, kind of reflecting on this is that if I did that, I wouldn't be the person I am today because my experiences would be different. I kind of like who I am. So I don't know if I would give advice on changing this decision or that decision, even though it might not have turned out, as well as it should. I would say, reflect on experiences more because there's so much more to learn. Even everyday experiences, if we took us a little bit of time to reflect on that experiences, there's something we can learn from that. And be humble about your response and your reflection.
Absolutely. There's something, completely beautiful about this topic and this discussion on artificial intelligence as it relates to human in the loop, as it relates to human reflection. And I think as we think about AI and the impact on our economy, on every market space, on our very way of life and everything that we do, the fact that there are still many, many, many operations, if you will, many, many things that we do as humans that are uniquely human, and being able to reflect and to contemplate and to bring things like ethical considerations, or for that matter, spiritual considerations into our thought process. Those are things that our AIs are probably never going to be able to do, and certainly never be able to do as a true human. So that importance of being the human in the loop, being responsible, being transparent, and diving in and using these technologies in a reflective way, really, really important. We've had a wonderful time today with our guest, Dr. Dwayne Wood of National University, talking about artificial intelligence, talking about AI and instructional design in the teacher experience and the student experience. Really, really fascinating episode. Can't thank Dr. Wood enough for being with us. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast, diving into generative AI and AI in general as we talk about instructional design. We had a number of different interesting points that were made on this particular episode. You can find all those points on our show notes, and you can find the show notes for this particular episode at techedpodcast.com/wood. That's techedpodcast.com/WOOD. I'm sure our team is leveraging AI and creating those show notes, but I can also tell you that Melissa Martin, our producer, is the human in the loop, making those show notes particularly human and particularly applicable. So don't miss the opportunity to check out those show notes. And don't miss the opportunity to find us on social media. We are all over social. You will find us on LinkedIn. You'll find the Tech Ed Podcast on Instagram, on Facebook, on TikTok. It doesn't matter where you go on social media. You will find the Tech Ed Podcast there. We will be there to help you and your students and your institutions secure the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Be sure to reach out, be sure to connect, and be sure to tune in next week to our next episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. For now, I am Matt Kirkner. Thanks for being with us.